the Holocaust, and then how you found yourself in the concentration camps, and who you were with, and.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was born in Poland, in Krakow, a city of 1 million people, and I was 9 years of age when the war started. I had a family of 6 people, 2 brothers and a sister and parents. That was the immediate family. My extended family, where the last time my brothers and I counted, we were close to 70 people. Uncles, aunts, grandparents. And none of them survived the war. And the beginning was the Germans marched into Poland. And pretty soon thereafter, the Krakow ghetto was created, and we Jews were herded into the ghetto. And all kinds of killings started taking place, individual killings, not en masse. And we were put to work, most of us. People started disappearing by the hundreds and thousands. They just came into the ghetto with trucks, and they just blew off the streets. That's how my mother and sister disappeared. Actually, my grandmother and her brother was interesting. He was a man who was 104 years old. Grandmother was 94, and they disappeared just in the very first beginning. And then my mother's sister disappeared, and
was this over a period of a year, less than a year?
This was over a period of years, over a period of 2 years, the ghetto itself.
What years are we talking about now?
We're talking about 42 now.
Okay.
Yeah, that was, it started at 39, and the disappearance of my mother happened in 42. But my grandmother, that was much earlier.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of terror being used, and the deceit. And
do you remember speaking with what was going on? I'm sure you, as a 9 or 10-year-old, you had many questions.
I had many questions, but there were no answers for these things. It was, and on some level, it was a big adventure, you know, because I was not realizing the immensity of what was going really on at that age. And then my mother disappeared. My brothers disappeared too, both of my brothers, and didn't know what was happening to them. Later on, we found out that they were in a salt mine, actually a salt mine, not too far from the city of Krakow in Poland. And those were just rumors. I mean, there was no definite
just terrifying.
Yeah, it was just, and this was happening to families. My father and I were together, and I was one of the kids who was running out of the ghetto and smuggling food and bribing policemen, and I sustained a whole family for a while, because I was small, I was pretty flexible, and I was quick. But and then the Germans, the SS, closed up the ghetto and started moving us out to a place called Plaszow, which was a concentration camp not too far from the city of Krakow.
May I jump ahead and ask you at what age you were out of the camps?
I was 15 and a half when at the time of liberation, I was liberated by the American Army in Germany. But there's quite a gap.
6 years of young childhood wondering what was going on.
Yeah, that's right.
So I suppose in your work these days you can relate to children fairly well.
Very much so.
And talk with them about world terrors.
Yes, world terrors, and they're very so much in touch with what is happening and the global threat to them much more so than we adults. We invent stories and have reasons for, but they don't.
Keep our
really.
minds busy.
Yes, yes.
Have you worked specifically with children?
No, not specifically, but I did do some showings and talk with children, and they ask wonderful questions. They ask right from the hearts. They don't have these considerations about, you know, that might hurt me if I ask that question. They just ask.
Right.
Adults, as adults, we have the reasons for, and we have pre-planned questions that don't come directly from the heart, for the most part.
And we've buried a lot of our questions in the terror of it and not wanting to ask.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
I'd like to complete about the process that was happening in the war and how I ended up in Auschwitz.
Okay.
The second camp I was in, since the war was coming closer, the Russians were invading Poland, and that's already another year later, about 43, and they started liquidating that camp that I was in. My father and I were sent to Mauthausen, which is a concentration camp in Austria, and then my brothers were in the same cattle car with me, and I don't remember it. At least they tell me about this. And then my father and I were shipped to Auschwitz. I was young, so what they're doing most of the time is, and my father was already 53 at that time, about my age now. And when we got to Auschwitz, when we got off the train, we went through the selection process, and there was an SS man at the head of the line, and he basically waved his hand in which direction to go. And we didn't know what that was about. We were in this camp, barbed wires and dogs and machine guns and a lot of terror. And so my father went to my left, and I went to the right. And what I found out about that hours later, when I was in another part of the camp, and smelling the burning flesh, and they told me what happened to my father. And he ended up in a gas chamber with 1,500 people. He was one of 1,500 people that were deliberately gassed because we were Jews. So Auschwitz was a place, was murder machine, murder factory is what it was. And people don't know about that. They're afraid to look at that, because if they did, we might look at the larger issues that are confronting us today, that I see are looming on the horizon.
Which are perhaps not so blatant, but once we look at them for what they are, it's very blatant.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Did you want to talk now about how you
literally woke up when I read a headline in a newspaper that said that we were within war with Russia within 15 minutes, and that was several months later. It came out that this event happened, and we didn't know about that. So that was kind of a hindsight information. And the following day, at that point when I read that, I found because it is not obvious. It is not obvious. My father was gassed, and someone threw in gas in the gas chamber. It was called Zyklon B. That was and there were bids made by the German munitions and factories and scientists, and money was made and improving it. And all the time they were gassing people, they were trying to make it efficient. And there's all kinds of tremendous records that exist of that whole so potentially we are in a planetary gas chamber, as I feel. And I don't want people to mix up the Holocaust with a nuclear issue. For me, they're two separate issues, but they're connected. See, we have forgotten about the Holocaust, and that's why we have the nuclear issue, because we didn't want to believe that 1,500 people were deliberately gassed in one time. In 24 hours, they disappeared like something like 12,000 people. No trace of them. The corpses were burned. The bones were ground down with machines to powder
So pretending that it didn't happen.
Right,
That
right.
no one would find out or no one would care to
Exactly.
find out.
Exactly.
And so they could get away with it.
Right.
Which is...
So we find ourselves, I'm finding myself as if I'm in a potential planetary gas chamber, and it's all because of how we believe about God, economics. That's a whole other issue. And how we make a living is one of the important issues of how we make a living and what do we contribute to this situation of, to the potential planetary gas chamber. And I want to emphasize it's a potential planetary gas chamber.
Ignoring the past.
I'm afraid it is not doing a very good job in preserving the peace. As a matter of fact, what I see, we did preserve peace for a long, long time, but in the past number of years, we have become the aggressor. Not so obvious. It's not so obvious. We're talking about peace and freedom and protecting our interests. But we keep creating and recreating the enemy. We keep looking, because of how we believe about God and economics, we keep creating the enemy constantly with our dealings
out there.
Out there. We don't want to look at our own potential Nazi, the potential Nazi within me, that exists within me, and not choosing every second, every moment, you know. So we project our evil. It exists out there, which is not the truth. It exists within me and within all of us. And yet we project it out there at Russia, at anyone else.
Acting as though cooperation isn't necessary, as though we need to protect the world from other evils which end up
creating that. And in the end, is where I'm seeing that we're heading to is a potential planetary Holocaust. And I don't like using the word Holocaust because Holocaust was specifically designed for Jews. You know, I mean, it was designed, we were dragged out from all countries of the world where Hitler had any kind of power, military or diplomatic, and sent us to Auschwitz or other places. So that's what makes it a Holocaust, a design. Here, we're all in a potential planetary extinction. And it is not by design, but it is by possibly stumbling into that kind of device. And we're not in charge of our own lives. And, you know, talking about freedom is kind of ridiculous because if you don't have the choice to life. I was reading today about the Constitution, you know, and it says the first thing, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, the first one says life. My life is being threatened, you know.
Yeah, and
because of the system that we live in.
Yeah.
And we need to change. There needs to be a radical change, that we see that we will...
Your education as a survivor has been one of consciousness and of not being able to forget. And it seems like the important message is that of awareness, in which you are doing by presenting your story. I would like to thank you for just the beginning and a glimpse, but I think we're out of time for this afternoon, I'm afraid. Thank you with us.
You're very welcome.
This is something that many people can look into for themselves, in awareness of the realities of our threat to ourselves. I think we'll close here. Thank you for being with us this afternoon.
You're welcome.
Okay.
For survivors of the Holocaust and their families, survivors of concentration or death camps and their families. And it will be in the extension catalog, 10 weeks, 1 credit. From 6:30 to 8.
And those of you who are interested in following up the lecture series in some additional perspectives, adding some additional perspectives to your knowledge, I'll be offering a course in sociology of the Holocaust next fall, which will be a Wednesday evening class from 6 to 9:40, which is open to all with some sort of background in the history or the Holocaust history and some degree of maturity. What we have found is that we should perhaps leave fresh men out of that particular course. Other than that, everyone is more than welcome to participate. And as I said, it's going to meet only once a week from 6 to 9:40. And those of you who are interested in a handout,
you want me to use this? Good afternoon. My name is Virgil Miller of the Community-Based Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust here at Sonoma State University. This lecture series is sponsored by Sonoma State's Holocaust Study Center, the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, and the Sonoma County Department of Education. Today's topic is After Surviving the Holocaust, Adjusting to the Psychological, Sociological, and Existential on the Holocaust Center, and Daniel Benamayas. Gloria Lyons, who was originally scheduled to be here today, will be unable to attend. She's on a speaking tour in Germany. Next Tuesday will be a lecture by Fred Rosenbaum, historian and director of the Lehrhaus Judaica of Berkeley, Stanford, and San Francisco. His topic is Holocaust, the Political Consequences. Now I would like to introduce to you today's guests.
Exactly a year. That's right. We haven't met. I'm Jerry Rosenstein. I'm Paul Beck, fellow of law.
Paul, please be aware that this picks up the sounds of the table, so this will pick up audio speaking, so anything like that will be picked up on this. So please be careful.
I'll be ready to Hannah? What's the format of this? Do you want us to introduce ourselves? Who's the moderator? Who's the moderator? Am I the moderator? Oh. Well, I've been elected to office in the last 15 seconds, so you know, my God, I had a program. No, it just says panel of survivors. I'm just the first one. Right. Well, being low in the alphabetical totem pole, I think maybe we will work our way from right to left, unless there are no political objections in this audience. Our topic is surviving the Holocaust, adjusting to the sociological and existential, the personal view. I'm very glad about this since I teach in biology and I'm neither a psychologist nor a sociologist. I suppose I'm an existentialist to some extent. So I'm going to allow you to introduce yourselves. And,
my name is Daniel. I was born in Salonika, Greece. It's a town northern part of Greece. During the war, the Germans occupied Greece in 1941, and they divided the country into two different areas. or areas of jurisdiction, I should say. The northern part, which included Salonika, was under the German jurisdiction, and the southern part, which included Athens, was under Italian jurisdiction. The Germans, after they invaded the country, for a period of 2 years, didn't do anything or didn't give any sign that they were going to start measures, anti-Semitic measures in the country. And suddenly in 1943, hell broke loose. They started with Star of David, ghettos, blackmail of the Jewish Community Council for money, and funding of the trains and the gas chambers. My family and I moved to Athens, and we stayed there till Italy surrendered to the Allies. And then we went into hiding. We were betrayed. We were picked up by the Gestapo and then sent to Auschwitz. When we arrived at Auschwitz, my parents, of course, went to the gas chambers, and I was assigned to the quarantine camp for a period of 1 month. And then I was transferred to the Sonderkommando, which was a special task force they called, the Germans called it special, it has a connotation there anyway. It's always macabre word in the camp. It was a commando which worked in the crematorium. I worked there for almost 9 months, and then I was in retreat that Dr. Steiner mentioned last time on the 10-day march. Then the open boxcars arrived in Mauthausen, and then I was transferred to Ebensee in Austria, where I was liberated by the forces of General Patton. Then I returned to Greece. I got married in 1951, came in this country, and I live in Auburn. I have 2 children.
I'm Jerry Rosenstein. I was born in Germany, and as a 7-year-old boy, we moved to Amsterdam. 2 older brothers and my parents and myself. My oldest brother went to what was then Palestine, became a soldier in the English army, and was killed in action in 1944. My second oldest brother was sent to Auschwitz in 1942, where he died apparently, or was gassed in 1940. My parents and I were picked up from Amsterdam early 1943. We were sent to Westerbork. My parents then were sent to Bergen-Belsen. I was sent to Theresienstadt. Then both my parents were sent to Theresienstadt. My mother survived Theresienstadt. My father and I were both sent to Auschwitz. Both of us survived Auschwitz and Gleiwitz. We were also on that very same march, but we were at the tail end of it. And we were liberated by in a place called Blechhammer, which probably has some different Polish name today. Subsequently, we spent, this was late January, we spent through the month of April traveling through Poland and Romania to Odessa, from where we went by ship to Marseille. And my father and I were together all this time. And a miracle under the circumstances. Been here most of my life, in other words.
Well, I was born in what is known as Transylvania, which is a western territory of Romania, and which I often refer to as the disputed area because it's a football between Romania and Hungary. So depending upon who you talk to, they were born in the same town, either in Hungary or in Romania, but it's just the borders moved back and forth. I lived in a town called Cluj. It is now called Cluj-Napoca, which is the ancient name of the Roman fort on those ruins. The town of Cluj is a town that is about 100,000 people, of which there were about 20,000 Jews. In 1940, some of you may recall, a part of Romania was given to the Hungarians. Came major changes in the political governments of both countries. The Romanian government, which was headed by essentially through a military takeover by a man by the name of Antonescu, and the Romanian Iron Guard, which is a code name for the Romanian Nazis, took over Romania. while in Hungary there was an internal struggle about which extreme rightist was going to take over the government, and some less than the most extreme rightists took it over. They took power later on. But to make a long story short, the net result was that anti-Jewish laws were passed, and so as soon as the border changed and we came under Hungarian rule, all Jews were felt suspect and threatened, and there were efforts to remove businesses, to prohibit employment, to prohibit all kinds of ownership and so on. So there was, on the one hand, only a shift in governments, but a shift in populations from rural to the countryside, because rural life was made impossible for people who had lived there a long time. The Hungarians passed a series of laws which essentially meant that people who could not prove that they had lived there for 200 years were deported. And deportation was a euphemism for picking mines in the Ukraine. The German force did not employ mine sweepers. They employed people walking in front of the forces, and that's how mines were picked. Now, often people were recruited for so-called labor battalions, but the primary function of the labor battalions was to walk in front of troops when they suspected minefields and explore that. And there are survivors of these labor battalions, believe it or not, very few, but they're very, very rare. Now, the period I'm describing is a period between 41, 42, and 43. The events of the war changed sharply. The Hungarians insisted that the Germans honor a promise they made to them, and the promise the Hungarians extracted from the Germans was that they would solve their Jewish problem. Big surprise, isn't it? The promise was that the Hungarians would be deported. Now, we know from the testimonies of such people as Eichmann and others that at this time the entire system was clogged, and they didn't know what to do with prisoners anymore, but nevertheless they insisted. So we were then deported from my hometown, Cluj. People were moved from various sections of the town to an abandoned brick factory, and so with about 2 days, families were told to report to the brick factory. Some people were exempt, and it turned out that I was living with my father at the time, and my father was exempt because he was a, quote, exempt employee. Exempt meant that you worked for some industry that was important for the war. He worked for a shoe and leather company, and they were involved in making shoes. So we escaped the fate of the brick factory, which was about 3 weeks later. They decided they could do without his services, and then we reported to the house of detention in Cluj, and from there we were shipped to a camp in western Hungary near the Austro-Hungarian border. The camp also had next to it Yugoslav prisoners and Yugoslav families who had been removed from, quote, the zones in Yugoslavia. There was a tremendous amount of upheaval in these times, and the Germans were recruiting workers from all sources, and the removal of these workers was really an excuse to make a cheap workforce, for the war effort in Germany. But from these prisoners we found out what our fate would be, because they told us they were very generous people, and at a time when everybody was starving, they threw bread over the fence, which was really knives in their hands. They would stand next to the fence and they would throw loaves of bread over for us, and they didn't know us from anybody. They could barely talk to us, but most of them were not from parts of Yugoslavia where they speak Hungarian, and very few spoke German. And this period of time, the Germans eventually took over from the Hungarians and shipped us off to Auschwitz. And we arrived at Auschwitz, and there met those those inmates who were taken to clean up the Warsaw Ghetto. So the first news we heard of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising were those people who had been there and told us about what went on at the Warsaw Ghetto. I was in Auschwitz, and then we were shipped out of Auschwitz, and we were in several camps in Bavaria, in Kaufering and Kaufbeuren. We were in Kaufering, and it's near a place called Landsberg, which is we used to march by the jail that Hitler was locked in at one time, and used to give us a little sense of joy every morning that there is a jail there that he was in. But shortly, this was in the fall of 44 and up to January 45. By January 45, the camp that I was in had lost so many inmates that they closed it and they sent us to Dachau. I was in a lager called K in Dachau, where we met the students who were involved in the Danish uprising, in the Danish protest. There were literally people from all nations. There were Russians, there were Poles, there were Danes, there were French, Belgians, and there. We stayed in Dachau. My father died shortly after we arrived there. By the time we arrived to Dachau, he had been beaten very badly, and he could not stand, and he never left the showers from Dachau. And I found out about his fate from a German minister who was a long-time Dachau inmate and knew his way around and was able to check on the records. I don't know whether those records are not. I was shipped from Dachau on April 28th of 1945 to Dachau. The front lines were approaching, and as you know, that was a German policy not to allow prisoners to be taken. So they started shipping us out of there, and we were sent toward a town called Seefeld, which is a beautiful town in Bavaria. They set up a perimeter with machine guns, and we suspected that they were getting ready to shoot us. But we knew that the war was coming to an end because our guards were already carrying civilian clothes, those little gas mask packs. They had thrown away their gas masks. They were carrying civilian clothes. And we, shortly thereafter, they ran away one morning, and we marched to the sound of gunfire where the Americans were approaching. This was the war, as you probably all know, stopped in Europe essentially May 1st. We celebrate May 7th here. Actually, May 8th in the United States. The official armistice in Europe was May 7th, but I guess because of the time difference, we celebrated May 8th. There were a few holdout pockets, but there was nothing serious going on after May 1st. I went to a displaced person camp, and I got a job essentially 2 days after liberation as an interpreter, and I was in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which is an idyllic spot. The 1936 Olympics were held there, and it's still a great resort. And in this displaced person camps, there was a conglomeration of all languages, and there were 16 languages, but they had to be restricted to 5 because that's all I spoke, and the lieutenant in charge says, that's enough, I won't put up with 16, and that was that. So we had interesting problems in translation, and I learned a great deal about translating freestyle. I spoke English, but I couldn't write very well in English very well. I'd learned English conversationally. So we had some amusing moments in translating languages to each other. In this camps, there were also a great many White Russians who were forcibly repatriated, by the way. During my stay in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, I used to go into town. I got to know a lot of GIs because I worked for the military government, and I met an American couple at a USO show. And this American couple asked me what I wanted to do, and I said I wanted to leave Europe. I was signed up for a shipment to go to Abyssinia. The government of Abyssinia was hiring our assistant. I have no idea what they did. All you had to do is pass a test in which you could draw a rectangle, and you could calculate the area and show that you knew the elements of mechanical drawing, I guess. And I passed that test, and so I was ready. I knew that I didn't want to stay in Europe. And when I met this American couple, they asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, I'd like to get out of Europe. And they said, how do you like the United States? And I said, let's go. I'm packed. And shortly thereafter, I just needed enough time to let the people know around the military government, because they occasionally did check up on us to see that we didn't disappear. Garmisch-Partenkirchen was a hotbed of Nazi activity of various kinds. and they were a little wary about who was holed up where. So they used to check up on people who work for the military government that they don't disappear, and so I couldn't travel with my adopted parents to be right away without letting people know, otherwise they'd be looking. To make a long story short, I traveled with them to Paris and snuck across borders and bribed guards, and got a lot of false documents with cigarettes and wine and Cointreau and whatnot. So I found myself in Paris in 1945, and I presented myself to the Romanian legation in Paris, which was still there, and they issued me a false passport, a passport of 2 pages, and the Americans gave me a visa because I promised that I would get a ship's ticket, and I got here November 5th, 1945. And I went to high school for a semester in Los Angeles, and then I found blood relatives. I had been out of touch with them because they were not in the telephone book. And in the United States, if you're not in the telephone book, you're lost. So I found my aunt, who lived in New York then, and I went back and I lived with them for a semester or so, and then I went on my own, and I went to high school in New York. I went to school in Berkeley, and then to Davis, and
well, I guess it's appropriate, since you've heard from the South, the West,
right.
Central Europe,
Right.
that you should hear from the East. How many of you have seen Shoah? Okay, well, my name is Michael Thaler, and I was born and raised in one of those towns of eastern and middle Poland, particularly that part of Poland where Russia is now occupying force, that is the western Ukraine. I was born in 1934, which is approximately 5 years before the war started, and approximately 7 years before the Germans came. As you heard about Transylvania, Poland was, you may recall, those of you who know that phase of world history, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact divided Poland into two, into a western Nazi-occupied zone and eastern Russian-occupied. But that pact was breached in the fall of 1941, and at that point we passed from Russian occupation to German occupation. Now, another point of difference, or another point to be made, I should say, is that the 3 people on my right, 3 survivors on my right, survived from concentration camp, basically from one camp, Auschwitz. And I represent one other way, a much rarer way in a sense, and that is the way from the ghetto to the forest. Okay. I think it's important for those of you who study the Holocaust to realize that in the machinery of the Holocaust, in other words, in that whole process called the final solution to the Jewish question, there was a sequence, a very definite sequence which repeats itself wherever you come from, whether you come from Salonika, whether you come from Transylvania. There was always a sequence, especially since 41, since Poland was occupied. I should also point out that of the population of Poland at that time, in 1939, which is 33 million, a full 10% was Jewish. That's 3.5 million, 3.3 million of that population was Jewish. Okay, and since 97% were killed, then essentially more than half the 6 million that you hear about came from that. Now, when this process began, which I guess formally initiated with the Wannsee Conference, which occurred somewhere around January 1941, at which the actual process was of solving the Jewish question by extermination rather than by expulsion, exile, whatever. When that started, the initial phase always was isolation. The Jewish population had to be identified, marked or armbands, and separated from whatever indigenous population they might find themselves in for obvious reasons. One reason being that they would be there and helpless and isolated for whatever purposes, for labor or for killing or for whatever, or mainly for actually getting most of their belongings for the occupying force before they were, transported or deported or whatever. And subsequently, they established these penal colonies, which they euphemistically call ghettos, in which this is one of my personal vendettas, that we use the Nazi terminology in describing these places as ghettos, which they weren't at all, because most of the time they weren't even in the original Jewish districts. And basically what they were is camps, which were either labor camps or just detention camps, deportation to death camps. Okay, so that period of the ghetto began with approximately 10% mortality throughout, wherever you were, per year from epidemics, particularly tuberculosis and typhus, particularly, for instance, major ghettos like Warsaw and Lodz had a 15 to 20% mortality from these epidemics, plus, of course, severe, unbelievable starvation. Approximately 60% of the population within a year after Nazi occupation had been infected with tuberculosis. And of course there were no drugs and no particular means of getting out or getting food in. And at that time, which were supposedly still good times, 1 loaf of bread was issued per person per 5 days as the food ration. At the end of the ghetto, which was, by the way, was the longest surviving ghetto of any of them, which was, it lasted till August 19th, they were exposed. So now we went into this ghetto in a Shoah-like small town in eastern Poland, near a big city named Lvov or Lemberg, depending on which way you're coming, east or west. And as you pointed out, you could have been born in Hungary or in Romania, but you actually were born in Russia, right? Sort of, because the occupation. Anyway, the fact is that these people who occupied the area were Germans. The indigenous population, the Ukrainian population, was among the most, of course, rabidly anti-Semitic of any European population, but in particular, they were given special incentives, as the Hungarians were, to assist the Germans in this process, because they were promised autonomy. There were 2 SS Ukrainian divisions fighting on the Eastern Front, and all volunteers, and most of the camps, including the Western camps and so on, were managed basically by Ukrainian militia, who were quite brutal. So we were inserted into this camp and surrounded by Ukrainian police, and basically they proceeded to starve us to death. At that point, my father developed a philosophy which said, we don't know anything. We're totally ignorant. We're kept under a bell jar. We have no information about what they want to do with us, really. And we don't know what's happening on the outside. Of course, this is 41, 42. At that point, the German armies were still moving ahead with the blitzkrieg, 100 miles a day. And it looked like no one would ever stop them. And so my father took me out of the ghetto and brought me 4 miles out of town to an old Polish couple, childless couple, whom we had befriended, before this started, where we had lived in the area. And they sort of liked me a lot, and they were childless, as I pointed out, religious. And they harbored me, hid me for about 8 months, while my parents, of course, were in the ghetto. And at that point, since I had nothing else to do and couldn't show my face, since I was known to the kids and the people in the area, and there was a price on the head of every Jew, so many zlotys, which is, so many dollars. And it was instant death just to be out there, outside the ghetto anyway, without a band, without a star. And so I had to be sort of kept in, and at that time I learned how to read and write from the catechism, the lives of the saints, and the litanies and the prayers, and et cetera, and I became a good little Polish Catholic, and there's no better Catholic than a good little Polish Catholic, believe me. I mean, it's wall-to-wall Catholic country. So at that point, it became apparent that the Nazis, the Germans really, call a spade, the Germans, because every German in that region was basically working for the machinery. In any case, at that point, it became apparent to the Germans that the Jews were being hidden or had managed to stay out of the ghetto here and there. So I was saying, but my father had this policy, we don't know anything, we don't know what's going to happen, but the one thing we know, that whatever they want us to do can't be good for us Jews. So he had developed his own sort of form of resistance where just don't believe them, whereas it was so easy, so much simpler to believe when they said, okay, if you go to this train with your belongings, and we'll take you to some other place where we'll feed you and you're not going to be starving anymore, you're going to be working for the war effort, etc., etc. Thousands and thousands of people went that way, and my father just simply said, I do not believe them, and if I can do anything to oppose whatever it is that they want us to do, I will, and that's why he put me out. In any case, but that only lasted about 8 months because they started to search these areas, and when they Jewish family hidden by what is now known euphemistically as righteous Gentiles, they would take out these Gentiles as well as the Jews, bring the entire population to the middle of the square, and hang them to make their example. Everybody hanged. Okay. So my father took me out of there, you know, one night, snowy night in the winter of 1942, and brought me back to the ghetto, which by that time had shrunk from 12,000. I should have mentioned that these small towns that you saw in Shoah, which you may recall, those of you who saw it, were 65 to 80% Jewish. So the Jews were actually majorities within their own areas, since there were so many of them, and most of them were concentrated in that region. Anyway, by that time, in our town, starting with 11,000, by that time there were approximately 6,000 left, okay? Mostly from starvation and from infection and from random shootings. You know, who would just come in, and just to spread terror, they would start shooting or searching houses and dragging people out and just laying them out and killing them. And in addition, the Judenrat, which was mentioned before, the Jewish Council, was constantly being forced to deliver more furs, more clothing, more gold, more money, more labor, until eventually it couldn't provide it. And so then they would swoop down and take 200 people and just take them out to the old Jewish cemetery, dig a grave, Koreans dig the grave, and shoot them. And this reduced the ghetto to by about 50% by early 1942, late 1942, yeah, winter 42. And at that time, something dramatic happened, which was Stalingrad. When Stalingrad happened, and we had heard about it from, you know, radio and so on, we knew that at least the German armies were not invincible. At Stalingrad, 600,000 Germans died and 600,000 Russians died. This was one battle. Each side lost twice as many people as all of the United States the entire period of World War II. That's just to give you a little context. And in any case, but we knew at that point that the war probably was going to follow along Napoleonic lines, which, as you know, was a matter of gradual agonizing retreat for several thousand miles back from Moscow all the way to Paris. And we knew that that would eventually be the fate of Hitler and his country, except that we also knew that also an internal war. By that time we knew there was a war against the Jews going on, and there was just a question of, you know, which war was going to, we knew which war was going to be lost, but the question was really how well the Germans were going to win the internal war against us. In other words, whether we would manage to survive. In any case, the ghettos started to be liquidated around the middle of 1943, and this was true throughout Poland, throughout Eastern Europe. All of the ghettos began to be liquidated at the same time, in the same pattern. Now, you've heard probably the most famous one was Babi Yar. How many of you heard about Babi Yar? Okay, Babi Yar was nothing but the liquidation site of the ghetto of Kiev, which happens to be the central city of the region I come from. You know, I guess Lvov is about 100 kilometers west of Kiev, and Kharkov is the other one, 100 kilometers east of Kiev. And Kiev was typical, and there was Ponar, for instance, in Vilna, another in the capital of Lithuania, and there was Yagodovska Street in Lvov, where I come from. There were all these places where the ghettos were liquidated simply, since by that time the Germans were losing the war, and they were very tight on material and so on. And they were just simply killing off the Jews on the site. They were digging the big mass graves and killing them. The way they did it by BR, I guess they killed 30,000 people in one day. This was not an uncommon situation. And so about 40% of the Jews lost their lives in this manner, straight out of the ghetto, until there was nothing left in the ghetto, and then they would liquidate it, post signs saying Judenrein, clean of Jews, and after that you were outlawed. You couldn't live there because you were no longer supposed to be alive, and any Jew that was found anywhere would immediately be shot on sight or whatever. And so at that point, we beat Judenrein, the final action, by 4 days. My father, by that time, was in a forced labor camp in the east, working on a road for the Wehrmacht. And my mother and I, that's all there was in the family. We had 50 members of the family. All of them died. Just my mother and I. We got out of the ghetto 4 days before Judenrein because she'd heard that the neighboring ghetto where her sister lived was destroyed a week before, so she knew that it was coming. And the last one would be the next one, because there were only 3,000 people left, and 3,000 was a manageable amount, and they could just kill them off, okay? And we for us, and 4 days later we heard the shooting and the shouting and the screaming, and that's what it was. It was the rest of the Jews being killed. all day long, you know, just shooting all day long until the evening when I lost count. I was trying to count. About 1,500 shots I counted, and eventually I lost count, but there were about 3,000 Jews left. So that they all essentially went that day. So we ended up in the forests and started, to suffer from exposure and obviously severe hunger. We had a little bit much, which my mother salvaged. Eventually, there was just no way out but to come back to that couple, that old couple, because this was our only, let's say, tenuous link to life. And we asked them to take us in, and they were deadly afraid because the events of the previous 2-3 weeks were very fresh. Anyway, they took us in. They put us in a hayloft up above a barn with animals, and the old woman with some food for the goats and the chickens, and underneath they would bury a bit of bread or something, and at night we could come down the ladder from the loft and pick it up. Well, about a couple of weeks later, we heard someone at night rummaging around among the animals and sneezing and coughing, and we thought some neighbor's kid found out that there were Jews hidden there and was just sort of, trying to hear where we were, and we were just terrified. And in the morning, we heard these footsteps coming up our ladder into the straw and the hay where we were hidden, and it was my father. My father was the only survivor of the ghetto of the camp that he came from. He eventually made it back to the town and was told that his father and his sisters and his all the other relatives were seen to be taken up to that place, because they all walked, in a long procession. And then no one had seen Mother or me, and he had some last hope that we might be still around, and the only place he could think of was the same place we could think of, and that's where we met together, and another miracle like your miracle about being together with your father. In any case, finally, after about a month, these people came to us just terrified again that the Germans had sealed off the area and were searching house to house because they had heard that there were Jews. And of course we assumed it was us. And we had to just wait until the stars came out, like they do with, before they pray in the evening on Friday in the Jewish religion. You have to wait until the stars come out. So we waited because apparently God is going to come out at that time and listen to you. So we waited and we got out. And we just made it before those the German commandos and the Ukrainian police broke down the door on the other side, and we got out into the forest and we foraged wherever for food. And finally, after about 3 months that way, I don't recall exactly the period. My father wrote a diary on scraps of paper, and one of these days I'm going to read it from the original Yiddish and put it together in English. But in any case, finally. We had to come back to those people. And when they saw us, they dropped on their knees and crossed themselves 100 times because they hadn't been able to sleep since we left, because they thought that Christ was going to let them burn in hell for eternity for allowing us to leave and presumably to die. And they were so extremely overjoyed to see us that we were harbored there for the next 3 months, and then the Red Army came and liberated us. And of course, the Iron Curtain came down within a couple of months after that. This was late 44, and you know about the Iron Curtain. And that meant to us that those who were Polish citizens before 1939 in that part of Poland was going to be integrated into Russia. If they chose to remain Polish citizens, could opt to go to the part of Poland which they had annexed from Germany, Silesia. And so we were brought directly to Silesia, and we lived there. Very quickly it became apparent to my father again that this was just exchanging, not nearly as bad a regime, but still a dictatorship for another dictatorship. And we smuggled down to Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, and we ended up near Mauthausen. And we were there in the DP camp for 3 years. And on the first anniversary of Mauthausen, of the liberation of Mauthausen, I had the great honor of cutting the ribbon and reciting the Kaddish over 10,000, the grave of the 10,000 of the last. I just wanted to let you know that. I didn't know that. In any case, eventually we got out because my mother had one surviving relative in Canada in 1948, and then I went to the University of Toronto Medical School and Harvard Postgraduate School, and I ended up here at the University of California. And there you go.
since our topic, I think, is survival, I think as I recall, in testing this particular program, was the intent of the planners of this course to dwell more on adjusting to the post-Holocaust period rather than the period of extreme suffering, let's say. And so I'd like to ask my fellow panel members to discuss it in this light. We'll let you.
Well, I think I understand what you're saying. The feelings that we have after the liberation, let's put it this way, is that it? Well, they're kind of mixed, because in the beginning you felt that after what has happened, this world will be entirely different. People will think differently, they will gear their minds differently. And after that, slowly it goes back to ground zero, and you realize that I don't think anything has been achieved. Even with our talks and with our exposure of the facts. Because I feel that, I consider the German people guilty for what has happened. Not as much as Hitler as Himmler. I think the German people, they have allowed to, or they have embraced the idea of super race. They have at the same time paved the way to the gas chambers. And I feel that, yes, in Germany it was an extreme condition, what we have seen that happened in Germany and in Europe. But we see that clusters of people now, in our time, gather together and they think they are superior. Once you think that you are superior, you are already in the bad path. That's why I feel I am very pessimistic, and I don't think that we have achieved, or the events have pushed us to a new area, a new platform. I think we are where we were, with different words, with different feelings, maybe. That's my feeling.
Well, I think the focus of this is how did we survive survival, and this is very interesting. I'd like to be a little personal about this and talk about how we survived as a family. There are very few families where 3 out of 4 came out of a concentration camp alive, and we were fortunate enough to be one of those. However, we did very strange things psychologically seen in 1987. We became family once again. We lived outside Paris in the banlieue. I went to school. My father had some business dealings. And we didn't never, ever deal with what happened to us in the preceding years. We had an unwritten pact, and we had this unwritten pact virtually to the end of my mother's and my father's life, that there was never going to be any discussion of Auschwitz, of concentration camps, of Bergen-Belsen, of anything. Obviously, we did talk about my brothers who were no longer there, but we avoided talking about the camps totally. We couldn't deal with it. We never dealt with it. And this became virtually an unwritten law. Life had to go on, and if we only could go on by not dealing with it. Because we were fortunate, we were not in a DP camp, and we were virtually thrown back, unprepared, into the real world, into real life, very rapidly, without any transition. In 1945, there was the science of psychology, and psychological help was not developed. There was nothing available to us. And we all needed it extremely badly. But it simply was not available. And I think most of us were quite damaged and quite shell-shocked and did not deal with us, particularly the younger ones. I was very young at the time. And really did not deal with things until at least when I went through a couple of years of therapy and analysis. But had help been available, psychological help or therapy or counseling been available to us, and had we been willing to accept it, I think survival would have been psychologically a lot easier for us.
Well, unlike you, I was the only one left in my family. And at the end of the war, I knew I was the only one. I was an only child. And I found out that my mother had died in Auschwitz. In fact, before I even got to Auschwitz, she had been deported first. She lived in another part of town. And the period of time that I was between a slave laborer and the period of time that I had entire discretion over my time and my body was essentially 2 days. So within 2 days, I was a free person, and my father was dead at the time, and the only people I knew immediately were 6 other boys the same age as I, who sort of hung out together. And we hung out together because English, and we had to deal with the Americans. They knew sooner or later we were going to have to deal with the Americans. So I was the elected leader, I guess, by default, because I could talk to the Americans. And this was essentially our fortuitous support group. But the support group melted as some died. They became ill in black medical detachment headed by an MD who knew Prontosil, because I was walking doubled over, and I knew that I had something wrong in my chest. And having gone to school in Europe, everybody in Europe learns the name of Prontosil. It's the only good drug we had. And the Prontosil are sulfa drugs. And I asked him, and he knew immediately. And so he helped us and cautioned us about what foods to eat. Some people didn't pay any attention to his help. But so, you know, it was a fortuitous bit, because the joy of liberation could have led to our deaths, because we didn't know what we were eating. And we were all very hungry, and he did caution us to eat those silly cereal bars, powdered milk, and things like this. And the army's full of 4,000-calorie chocolate bars. I don't know if you've ever seen one. It's just one. It's this big and this long. It's 4,000 calories, and it's intended to make you it's a day's meal for when you're surrounded by hostile troops and they can't supply you. And I think those 4,000-calorie chocolate bars, unfortunately, cost a lot of lives. But that was my first support group. I, on the other hand, felt enormously responsible for them. And there was a period of time where I reflected on the role of leadership and on the responsibilities of leadership that didn't all leave a good taste in my mouth. But the period of survival also raised issues about trust, because we would enter towns which we literally didn't know. And there is something about being incarcerated which I think leads people to be what is known as con-wise. I don't know whether this comes from close association in other forms, but I don't know whether you've observed it. But I think you would get to a new camp and you'd look around, you could tell who the cruel capo and who the friendly capo was.
Oh, you had it in your fingertips.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, you've probably heard people say that they enter a room and they know who the policeman is in the room. Or if you know cons, they'll tell you that, and it's true. You don't have to show badges and such, and you develop a sense about trust and feeling that does make you apprehensive. The time I got to Paris, which was I was liberated in May, and I got to Paris the end of July. I had no trouble picking up the French police at all. And even though this was just after the war, the French were disgustingly proper about whether you had certain documents. And étranger is about the lowest word in the French language. If you go to the French prefecture of police in Paris, I had to get an exit permit from that country. it's a block-long building with a series of little cubby holes like old-fashioned American banks used to have, and these guys with the green shades and the sleeve protectors are behind that. Now, it is 1945, the Second World War. There are GIs walking on the outside. There are no windows attended by any people. There are no French in there, and there is one window which is étrangère, and that lines comes out and winds twice around the block. That'll give you an idea of what the French thought of the étrangère. So you learn to deal with these things, but the matter of trust becomes difficult because the world that you knew and that you grew up in, where the lines of trust and lines of faith are established by one set of rules, is entirely overthrown. And if you're a career criminal, you'd have good lines on who are good forgers and who are bad forgers. Now, that's a crucial issue. That's something that you have to learn in jail. Because if you're a bad forger, it'll cost you a life. Order, and you show the wrong passport, and they'll pick you up. So you begin to learn skills that you never thought you would ever want to learn. But above all, it's the perception of whom you can trust and whom you can't trust that becomes a crucial issue. And it does distance people, and it does lead to an apprehension, and it gradually wears down with anything. But there is that time when in 1945, I arrived in New York City, by the way, and I didn't expect the streets to be paved with gold. A lot of us, grew up in Europe, and really, we did have an education. We didn't expect this to be so miraculously different. We were surprised by the differences. What helped me most was that I arrived here and people didn't assume that I was disabled. They only knew that I was in some kind of trouble at one time. And I think that the reactions consequently were, the treatment wasn't extraordinary. In Europe, if you enter a new town, there's a very long warm-up period before you're, in a sense. I would say, generally speaking, in the United States, there's a very short warm-up period, but you're not really very close yet, but you don't know that. That you really have to know Americans a lot better than you'll know them the first day. But they are much more open and much more inviting and much more willing to discuss matters which are of first, second, which are very highly ordered in Europe. There's some things we just talk about, not at first meeting. So since this lexicon of superstition about how people ought to behave isn't so strong, it was easier for me to adjust in this kind of free environment. Well, 3 weeks after I arrived in New York, and I was just beginning to learn how things work around here, I was exposed to things like the automat. And I remember how shocked I didn't believe that there was that much food in the world. I was convinced that the entire world was on food rations. And then I met my friends here, and they told me about their hardships. And they described their hardships, so frankly.
Gasoline rationing.
Yeah, gasoline rationing. And, there was only a quarter pound of butter for a whole week. And I remember going for a year, wondering what butter. Or I remember we went from one high holiday to the next high holiday without any meat. And my grandmother had saved, the breastbone on a large chicken. What they used to do is save this breastbone and dry it. And then when you got some kind of meat or some kind of mystery meat or some kind of thing, they would chop it up and pack it around and put the same thing out again. And so it was there over and over. I think that bone had seen glorious with many, many strange meats. Well, I couldn't believe about this kind of wealth. And so I think it led to a feeling that there was less stringency about the necessities of life here as there were in Europe. I went to to high school in Los Angeles was a totally confusing situation because this was, yeah, I think for anybody, because first of all, it's a coeducational high school, and this was an era in which men's white shirts were very hard to get. I don't know why, the war effort was using men's white shirts. I've never even seen officers in white shirts during the war, but they were very hard to get, and the girls at high school dressed in jeans or in slacks with white shirts in which every one of their friends had to autograph. To this day, I don't know the meaning or the deep significance of this. It eludes me. But I was amazed that they had no idea about what war was, what a shortage was, what a bombing was, and tentative inquiries about what went on. But I also soon learned that they were simply totally unprepared to hear what happened. So, and it was inconceivable to me to tell them in detail what happened, because they just couldn't even listen to it or perceive it. Or they knew that it was a terribly hurtful thing, but that was the limit of their perception. And I tended to avoid it because it also evoked a sense of pity, which is not what an aspiring young male would like from a woman, frankly. So that I tended to not discuss this, and I lived in areas where I didn't see other ex-inmates, or I missed being a teenager entirely. There was a moment when I had to step in. I took on the responsibilities which my father had, and they were awesome in the sense that I was afraid of giving away information. I was afraid of making the wrong judgment. I was afraid of making the wrong decision. All those afraids would end in a death. It wasn't merely not looking good in my life. But in survival, by reflection, I benefited by the fact that my aunt had 3 children, 2 boys who were a little younger, and one daughter was a little older than I. And they gave me a sense of balance and perspective about how teenagers really look at the world. And whereas at first I had contempt for them. What do they know about the world? And I was, and I couldn't spend an afternoon with them, and they were dull, boring. I had done serious things. I was interested in this. Being around them and learning some of their patience, and because they were American and they were very open and very, very easily approachable, and they couldn't understand why I was not. And they just refused to believe that I was so damaged that I could not. I think that helped me a great deal, and gaining perspective and joining this group that I was to join in terms of age and experience. In my experiences at Berkeley were shot. I went to a high school in New York, by the way. I should mention that was enormously helpful, is that it is a strongly intellectually oriented high school whose teachers are among the most dedicated I've ever met in my life. It was Stuyvesant High School. It's an all-science high school, but it never undercuts either the social sciences or the humanities. Their perspective on the world is truly global, and I thought that this was to be taken for granted. It's only when I met other people I realized that I had advantages that they had. And they introduced me to a view of human liberty that was very profound. I must tell you that Europeans do not grow up thinking of civil rights. Even educated Europeans do not grow up thinking of civil rights. In a number of European languages, the word freedom is identical with independence. If you say in Hungarian szabadság, you really say freedom from. It isn't freedom in the sense that you mean freedom in terms of civil rights. it isn't freedom in terms of civil liberties. What they mean is that the Germans are gone or the Turks aren't here. They do not mean that you are a dignified human being. And that aspect was brought forth in my high school on the one hand, and because my aunt was an immigrant who came here and discovered the value of free education when she came. She came in about 1928 or so, and she was a young woman, and to her this was an oyster. And so she was about 4'10", and I was petrified. The first day I was in her apartment, a New York police door, huge, burly guy, and he stood there, and she opened the door, and I remember to this day standing there, and she said, "And what's the matter with your hat?" With an accent. In Europe, this was suicide. And it's like a load went off my chest when the guy took his hat off and said, "Mrs. Friedman." And I suddenly realized that I had rights that didn't depend on his smile. And those were very healing experiences for me.
Well, I've just been sitting here listening and trying to penetrate this bewildering title to see what I could come up with that might be of interest to a general audience like this. Obviously, one cannot generalize a background that might be, let's say, the other part, the part that I can share with you, and perhaps come out with something that might be transmitted of use. And as you heard Ben-Ami say with that beautiful number over there, that his view of the world is pessimistic based on his experience after the war, that nothing had changed, and that no one had really learned many lessons or any lessons. Well, as I was younger than you, this was almost in my blood already, that lesson. Okay, I was formed by that kind of lesson, and what I guess I might want to talk about is first, the lesson also implies, a corollary of your lesson is that nothing can be transmitted to someone else, that what you've learned, you yourself in your own bones, in your own body, your pain and your knowledge, is very difficult, maybe impossible, to transmit to anyone else in any, let's say, quote-unquote, meaningfully existential way, okay? One can read books, one can, learn things intellectually, but only those who have some way of connecting with you and your experience are going to meaningfully act on that knowledge later. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's very unlikely, and I never considered it likely, that anyone would learn any lessons or actually existentially behave differently than they would otherwise. And so the experience, I guess, that differs as a survivor of that period is the experience of permanent exile, I guess is the best way to put it. Permanent exile, meaning that after you've been through this kind of extremely prolonged, constant, unrelenting danger to your life, not just danger, in a general sense, and the con thing. And of course, what you described is very much shared by most refugees, you have to keep in mind, because that's another experience of simply the old refugee experience of going from one country to another, from one world to another, in one world where a hat can kill you, and another one where a hat could, no one could care less, that sort of thing. All the rules, the culture shock, the whole thing, and that's partly of what you described. And I'm not even going to address that at all, because that I don't think is that the core and the heart, if there is such a thing, of the Holocaust experience. Okay, so the world that you live in today is in constant conflict and contrast inside you with the world that you came out of in those days, okay? And you constantly keep switching. And there was a movie, maybe some of you have seen, called Night and Fog, which probably was part of the course, or anyway. I mention that only because Resnez, who's got some very famous movies behind his belt, such as Hiroshima Mon Amour and Last Summer in Marion, but he, perhaps you don't know, made that movie in 1954. And the reason I mention it, to illustrate my point, is that he made it in black and white and in color. And the black and whites were all shot in, you know, from documentary footage, from the camps, from the crematoria and the gas chambers, etc. And was the present, you know, the way they looked now, and the people were alive and all that. And I would say that for me, as a survivor, the colorful world is the one, the lost one, the old one. That one I see in Technicolor. The one today, the one that after the war, I see in black and white. I'm trying to get through to you some kind of a sense of the kind of dislocating experience that this can be. All right. So now, very early on, it was very that it was us and it was them. And them was everybody else except for us. And that's what you were saying. Now, the problem was that them was killing us because they thought they were better than us and that we were somehow contaminating them. Okay. But I accept it as a given, the fact that there is us and that there is them as an existentialist given. And at that time, my job as us, representing us or being myself, was to survive. That was the key. You had to survive. Now, the reason my elders at that time gave for survival, whether it was because we had to be a witness, or whether we had to exact revenge, you know, or whatever the reasons that are still in currency today, it didn't matter to me as a child in the ghetto, in the forest, or wherever, and people shooting at me. I just had to survive, and what helped me to survive, I must tell you, is hate. I learned how to hate, pure, unremitting hate. I really hated with a passion. And you know, if I could have gotten my hands on some doom weapon that would have destroyed the world, I would have, without a doubt, with great joy and exultation, destroyed the world at that time. Now, some of that emotional energy, you may still hear in my voice, persists. And I think that every survivor, I know it's always dangerous. In fact, I said you must never talk for others because each has his own universal experience. Every survivor carries inside him, in his deepest part, the part he can't share, a wound which will never heal because there can never be justice, okay? It's that cry for justice that can never be satisfied because even, let us say, the entire nation of Germany, 85 million, all of them, every one of them, man, woman, and child, were lined up and brought into chambers and told to undress, and the women were shaved by other Germans who were trying to live in a week. And then you were on the other side of the door, right, and took out the bodies when the gas was over, 15 with the strongest on top and the weakest in the bottom, right? Okay. Even if that happened, there could never be justice because those victims never asked for that. They never asked for, you know, exile. They never asked for, you know, the murder of their families. They never asked for, you know, this permanent the entire world. So even if somebody else's world, the perpetrator's world, were destroyed, it would still not make it equal, ever. In other words, there is a fundamental impossibility of justice, ever. Okay? And it is that sense of permanent injustice which can be translated into, you know, that's the way the world is, that's life, whatever the usual expression, that never leaves any survivor, okay? And that's what makes them somewhat different. And finally, particularly, which I constantly tried to rationalize to myself, since nothing made sense, or whether vice versa, I applied those analytical tendencies to this experience, which of course is a priori irrational, I used to try to explain things. And I remember, I'll just give you two very brief vignettes and I'll stop, to try to explain what a child in that environment you know, felt and thought and how he explained his world. I mentioned that I was with these very devout and righteous and pious old Polish Jews, and if any of you know anything about Polish Catholicism, you know how ritualistic and well, you know, the icons and the whole bit, you know. And the walls were covered with the saints, and that's right, with saints and with crowns of thorns and bleeding hearts and towels with bloody imprints of Christ and so on. And I sort of, in a way, was formed in that environment. I could not understand one thing. Again, I told you I was trying to explain things. I could not understand one thing. And by that time, I believed in Jesus Christ. I used to spend my nights praying for my parents, not that they should be spared. It's that they were Jews and they were sinners, and because they killed Christ, you know, the usual dogma of the Polish Catholic. And they killed Christ, and so therefore the Jews were being killed, and they had it coming to them. But since I, as a good little Catholic, was going to go to heaven, and I really didn't want to spend a lot away from my parents, whom I found very comforting and comfortable, I was praying to Christ that he somehow revoke the sentence of all the Jews going to hell for killing him, so that they could somehow end up under special dispensation in heaven with me. So I wasn't praying for their bodies, for their lives, but for their souls, okay? But one thing I couldn't understand is why all these saints and apostles and so on were tortured and beaten and killed just the way the Jews were, that I knew about and nobody else was, until one day I came across lines in the lives of the saints, something the Catholic Church in Poland was not too happy to publicize, but it was very clear in my 8-year-old, 9-year-old mind, where it stated that all of those early people, all of these early martyrs were Jews, including Christ. And of course the light bulb went on, you know, all of a sudden everything, you see, everything, all these old saints and Christ himself were Jews, and they suffered the fate that I knew was reserved for Jews, and therefore everything made sense. Okay, now the second vignette, very quickly, as far as this exile part. So we were exiled even from heaven, in a sense, you know. When I regained my freedom, I still, believe it or not, continue to believe in the Catholic religion, even though my parents, you know, were Jewish and so on. And they might have handled this kid, you know, with all of this after everything that's happened. But I mentioned we left the Russian end of Poland, and went to Silesia, to Bytom or Boyton, German-Polish word, near Katowice, which some of you might have heard of, big city in the lower Silesian region where the coal mines were. Any case, so I attended, for the first time in my life, at the age of 11, I attended a classroom, a school. Taught myself how to read and write on the catechisms, I told you that. And at that time, 8 million East Germans were displaced into the western parts of East Germany because the Russians extended their zone of influence by transporting all of us Eastern Poles into that part of Germany. And so what happened was that the only population that was left were original Polish families with German backgrounds, which Polish couldn't speak anything except German. And so the role of the school system at that time was simply to teach these kids Polish religion, Catholicism, not Protestantism, Lutheranism, and the Polish language. And I and one other fellow who came from the East were the only, let's say, authentic Poles in the class. And we had nothing to do. So they weren't going to teach me anything new about the Catholic Polish religion, and they certainly weren't going to teach me any Polish. And so I had a good time, and eventually fell out with the other Pole, who was, let's say, a real Pole, okay? Mm-hmm. By that I mean that his parents didn't care if he got into fights and got his nose bloodied, and he was, a real, what the Russians like to call hooligan, a real tough little kid. And I was a nice little Jewish boy, and even though I didn't know it, or at least rejected it, and I just didn't, do that. And even though I didn't have to learn anything, I still was forced by my parents to sit there and, and catch up on the math and all that. So one day, the professor, the homeroom professor, called me aside and said, he asked me this way, are you Polski czy mozaiczny? He asked me, are you Polish or mosaic? Okay? Which was the educated, the highfalutin way the Poles had of calling you a Jew. Because the Jew, the word itself, inherently an insult, okay? So the fine way was to ask you whether you were mosaic or Polish. But you see, right there, within that culture, where my family had lived in that country for 400 years, longer than any of your families could even imagine being here, I was still considered not quite a Pole. I was this and not that. And so that was this kind of fundamental exile sense, that there was no home, you see. Even though in my own culture, I was quite at home in the world, okay? So those are the two examples I can tell you that to illustrate the deepest existentialist layer of the survivor experience is that you are uprooted, your world has been destroyed, you can never go home again, you can never get justice, and the only possible justice is perhaps eventually the destruction of the entire world, which none of us wish, including myself, because I'm a coward, because the thing to do is to survive. Thank you.
Questions? People should address questions to individuals.
Yeah,
we should repeat.
We have 14 minutes.
the majority of the people on the polls have all been men, and this is the majority. There have been a few women. And I want to know if you can give me some reason why. Did more men survive? Are there more men survivors? Or are more men into self-disclosure, so to speak, which is...
The majority of what? I didn't catch the
Of
first.
people that have come to talk to us about being survivors, about the experience.
Gloria,
Let me
Yeah,
repeat
go
the
ahead.
question. No,
I mean,
for the benefit
there's
of
been
the
a couple,
audience,
but throughout.
the question is, most of the people who have come here to speak have been men and not women. Is this because there are more men survivors? Or,
It's okay.
let me see, we're supposed to,
Well,
are we supposed to record this?
Who's supposed to answer the
I
question?
don't know. Anybody who knows the answer. I
Well,
guess.
I'd like to address myself to the,
Fussy.
well, I'd like to address myself to the issue.
Organizing it.
No, I would like to address myself to the issue a little bit, because those of you who have watched Shoah must have thought this was also a very male experience, and that the Holocaust was a very male experience. And unfortunately, it isn't so at all. It was a very 50-50 experience. However, the people that worked in the Sonderkommandos are those that were the best witnesses for the movie as Holocaust, and they were all male. Women simply did not work in the gas chambers or in the Sonderkommandos. As far as the experience here at Sonoma State University is concerned, maybe Gloria Lyon, who organized some of this, is male biased. I don't know, but
No. No, that's not true. Let me say that you need volunteers for this sort of thing, and we don't. We take the volunteers that we get, and we don't have. We know of women who do not choose to participate, and that's a entirely different problem.
But there were no more men didn't survive than women.
well, I don't know whether there are any
I
statistics.
don't know. I don't know,
Actually,
but I have
okay, there are that. More men survive than women, though this is not relevant, I don't think, to the question you're asking. More men survived simply because they were in positions to survive. Women were out faster, and they were gassed and killed faster. But that's really...
No, but it's part one of the question. Part
Okay.
two is...
I don't think that's why you have seen more males than females coming here. I don't think so.
But the part
Why
one
do
of
you
the
think that's
question, so, I'm sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
The part question maybe there's some truth into it, in the sense that when the Germans were sending people to the gas chambers, the mother would go with the child, usually. The father would not.
Sure.
Or in general.
Yes.
So there were many,
Sure.
many children
Yeah.
would accompany the mothers, and that's it. So the population, I would guess now, I don't know about it, but I'm guessing
No, it's true. I know.
that the majority, the bulk is men who survive. Now, there were women.
I think there's about a 35%.
Okay, that's right. Some a majority men.
I think the German
Almost all of you, or several of you, mentioned the fact, which I easily can understand, how difficult it is to share the experience, the internal, at least, what you internalize, the experience with others who have not been there. And what I do wonder, if you care to, any of you, to explain if there are any covertly any things that you do or do not do, or do think or do not think. I know you don't stop every time you do something to say, I do that because of that experience in 42, but if something major that you do or do not do these days because of that experience.
The question is, do we covertly do or do not do anything? Because, actively or subconsciously or consciously to behave in a certain pattern, and do we have such a behavior in common? Was that part of the question?
In common or individually?
Or individually? That's a very broad question. Who wants to address it?
If I understand it, it's do we do anything differently today because of our experience in those days? Well, that's
Do
all.
or do not do?
You said your whole,
Yes.
everything you said the
Yeah.
last time you
Yeah.
spoke was yes.
That's one thing we probably as survivors all have in common, is a certain behavior pattern and a certain psychological approach to things. You simply don't forget.
Philosophy, that I could understand,
Yeah.
but is there something pragmatically?
Oh, I don't know. I stopped looking over my shoulder.
Okay, I'll tell you.
Very good question, but I don't know.
When I was younger, okay, now I'm responsible for 2 kids and a wife and all that other, as Zorba the Greek said.
Catastrophe.
Yes, the full catastrophe. when I was younger, you could probably label, if you have a mind to do that sort of thing, labeling, I mean, you could probably label my behavior as acting out a death wish, okay? That's very facile to do because I was racing cars and I was behaving, in fact, as if I were basically indestructible, okay? After having gone through all that, I just felt that there was nothing that could stop. Drive cars at 120 miles an hour, and people would say, "Get me out of here, because I don't want to get killed with you." And I'd say, "Don't worry, you're with me." And they'd say, "What do you mean?" I'd say, "Well, as long as you're with me, you're safe, you see, because nothing can happen to me." So you see, and since then, books have been written about that sort of thing, you know, the survivor syndrome and all that. But I really want to give you an insight on that fact that it isn't really a death wish. It's really a sense of knowing that you've gone through all and beaten those, and there is a deep sense of invincibility and can't even say it anymore.
Indestructibility.
Yes, indestructibility in you, and you're constantly daring fate. You're testing it, in other words. You're testing the environment, like someone who's gone through a lot of danger and doesn't quite believe that it's over.
Will it work
So
again?
Yes, and so I find myself constantly testing the environment, even to this day, but though not in as overtly aggressive ways. So that's one example.
My question is less complicated. I'm wondering if any of you ever has a desire or a repulsion as concerns traveling back and actually visiting the place where you were born and the place where all this happened, or Europe as a whole.
The question was whether any of us have a desire, a repulsion, or a problem with going back to our root to visit places in Europe that are meaningful or hurtful to us. It's a very interesting question. Who wants to start?
Well, from my point of view, I say that there is a certain feeling of pain, not pain, but discomfort. At the beginning when you go there, the first time when you see things, but after a while it becomes a routine. I don't think it's such a difficult phase to pass. Now, you can make a big story about it, you can exaggerate the situation, but to me, it has not been a big complicated situation.
It's not a feeling of insecurity or that
Not
you're not safe there?
Not, well, that's a different thing now. I understand what you're saying now. I understand.
Well,
in that respect, you're right. In other words, you don't feel in any place in Europe, at least I don't, that I am safe, except the United States here. When I come here, I'm home now. But if I go out from here, I have question marks. War, terrorists, I don't know what, revolutions. Every time I used to go to Greece, there was a revolution or something. So you don't know what side you are. Suddenly you may be close there and not be able to come back to the United States. So that would be a tremendous shock to me because I'm used now here, and I think it's a very great country. However, the other part of the questions I told you didn't make much of a difference to me.
it's a question I'm frequently asked. Almost every time I'm at something like that, they ask me the question, because I'm German, and I was raised in Western Europe. In other words, I come from a part of the world which is far more accessible today than Eastern Europe would be. And for many years I did not go back, and for many years I didn't deal with it. But now, this is 1987, and for the last 20 or 25 years, I have dealt with things, and I have gone back, and I have learned how to separate the past from the present in a very concrete and substantial way. And there's somebody here, a dear friend in the audience, with whom I went back to Amsterdam last summer, where I was raised and where I was caught, and which for me had a even more painful association than going back to my hometown in Germany, where we left under fairly easy circumstances when I was 6 or 7 years old. And going back to Amsterdam is reliving the past and facing that in every other block you walk, there were friends and there were schoolmates and there were relatives, and nobody survived except you, except me in this case. And that was rather painful. However, to answer your question for myself, the broader question about going back and feeling for my safety, I feel just as secure or insecure in Amsterdam or in Frankfurt as I feel in Tokyo or Bangkok today. It's you know, it's the same. Things have become very global in my life, and those fears are behind me. But that I'm only, again, speaking for myself, and other people may have very different feelings and approaches on this one.
Well, I went back to Europe in 72, leaving in 45. I thought of going back to my hometown, but I'd known people who had difficulties, and the Romanian governments were up and down, and I didn't feel like challenging the locals on their rules. But I got a cheap flight, a Best Buy, to Frankfurt in 72, and as we were approaching, I sort of put it out of my mind. As we were landing, I did have a sense, and I knew that in 24 hours I would be out, and I felt a little better once I crossed the Swiss border. I don't, and let me say, in 1945 I was intensely hostile toward Germans, and gradually through various personal experiences that has changed, to very close friends and such. And people who helped me at a time when I really needed help, and they turned out to be wonderful people. But as far as visiting Europe is concerned, there are places where I feel at ease and places that I do not. I feel at ease if I cross the Italian border. I don't know what it is, but immediately it's as if, no, the food is excellent. Food in Switzerland is wonderful. Somehow I'm still a bit apprehensive that somebody's going to check every dot on my passport in Switzerland, but I know no one will do that in Italy. And I would never see the steely eye of the capo in Switzerland, in Italy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have that confidence. I don't have that confidence about other places. And I thought of going back. I keep threatening to take my children to show them where I was a juvenile delinquent. But I've sort of put it off.
Well, you know, Mussolini was once asked whether it wasn't very extremely difficult to govern the Italians. You know what his answer was? Not difficult, just useless.
Well,
anyway, well, those of you who saw a show will know the answer to the question as far as I'm concerned, because I came from one of those towns, and those people who saw one man, the one survivor, coming back to this village and standing among these graves and these places where he was working, to bury and then to take away the corpses and burn them and so on. And anyway, you saw how strange he felt among those people and who were still living in the Middle Ages with their, ideology and their myths and their devils and their Jewish, heretics and so on. And he was totally out of place, completely out of place. That was one thing. And the second thing is, you remember the camera moving along these streets, street after street, and these people, these peasants, these Polish peasants living in these houses with funny carvings, and Landsman asking a question, who are the people who live here? Oh, a butcher, what was his name? Stern, things like that. And, how many Jews were here? Oh, they were always, and the fact is that they're all gone. The whole world's gone, That's one thing Hitler did achieve, is destroy the Eastern European Jewish world. And so coming back to that place is about as strange to me as going to Patagonia, and so I don't have any particular feelings, negative or positive. It's just a very strange place. And I have a very strong sort of sense of loss when I think about what I remember the life was like in those days, with all the friends of mine and, of course, all the rituals of our world, and, that whole thing is gone. It's kaput. And that's the regret I have, but I don't feel any sense of threat or fear because, first of all, I'm indestructible. And the second thing is, these people are strangers. They're rather hateful strangers, most of them, and I have really nothing in common with them. So.
How has this experience your attitude towards religion and towards the state of Israel?
How has this experience affected our attitude towards religion and towards the state of Israel?
Well, first, in regard to religion, it has let's say, separated me, let's put it this way. I am not religious. And it did not occur before the camp and after the camp. Well, during and after the camp. I'm not impressed with religions in general. As a matter of fact, I think inwardly that they have done more damage than good. Now, I don't have, it's a gut feeling, because I've not got learned to say that, but this is the way I feel. So I have not had very strong religious ties. Well, some traditional that Israel was, they formed the state of Israel. Because there is a certain voice now of a certain community of Jews. You can talk about it, they have some background, some backing, let's put it this way. But that's to that extent, yes. But as I said, religion has been for me.
Well, my answer to it is yes and yes. I come from an Orthodox family and lost it all, but I am back with the synagogue. I am back active as a, albeit very, very Reformed Jew. And as far as the state of Israel is concerned, like my friend here, I'm not totally in favor of everything that's done, but I'm not totally in favor of anything anybody else does or any other state does. There is no such thing as perfection in this world, and don't expect it from us just because we are Jews.
We search for. Now, as my, I guess, views on religions really weren't changed by the war. I observed the crisis of faith for some, and that did occur for people in the camps. And I've also observed people whose faith was entirely unaffected by their experiences and is so strong that it's absolutely unshakable and will go on no matter what. I don't know. Those are not my problems or my needs, so I didn't have to address those questions. As far as the state of Israel was concerned, I considered it the only positive outcome I could think of the entire Second World War. It offered a homeland to people who were utterly adrift, and something that worked for a long time. I certainly don't approve of everything Israel does. I don't expect them to check with me either. Or any other country. I don't think that we walk on water as much as they aspire to, but they have all the human qualities that other people do.
Oh, I totally second, especially in terms of what you said about Israel, except to extend it to 2,000 years rather than World War II. The only really positive development in 2,000 years of Jewish history, I would say. The second part about the religion, that's very complicated. That's like asking you about your religion. What's your position on religion, and how did your life experiences affect that? Only more so, you know.
What's this question?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just facing it. Yes, yes. I'd rather look at you than him. That's okay. Yeah. There's a sexist remark, right? Okay. Well, you know, that's a very heavy question, and the point is that personally connect events in the world around me with formal religion. Okay, formal religion meaning the existence of a god, you know, rules, etc., etc. On the other hand, if you are referring to a belief that a code of ethics or a code of morality, let's say supported by some authority, whether supernatural or natural, is essential for survival among the nations, if you will, among people, then I feel strongly that that's the case, and that my experience merely reinforces that. In fact, my personal conceit in both the old English sense and the new current sense is that one of the main reasons why the Jews were singled out, not only by that particular dictatorship, but almost every other dictatorship, is precisely because they represent a kind of morality, a kind of sense of justice and of, let's say, egalitarianism or liberty that is inimical to these systems. Okay? And therefore they have always seen the Jews, whether the power of the day was the church, or whether it was the Tsar, or whether it was Stalin, for that matter, it was always the Jews. And it's too facile to say they were scapegoats, they didn't have the power, you know, and that therefore Israel, you know.
Yeah.
That also, but I think primarily is because the mere existence of this people and their persistence without a land base and without a power base for 2,000 years was a direct challenge, in fact, to any other system which was monolithic and, you know, pyramidic, you know, that sort of thing, dictatorial. And that's my personal, as I said, conceit, to think that that's one of the reasons why the Jews were selected by the Nazis for total extermination. So my answer is, there's a deep religious in all of this, particularly the moral aspects of religion, not the formal aspect. And in that sense, I'm more confirmed than ever that that's essential if any of us are going to survive.
We have time for one more question. Well, there's 3 hands up. Okay. All right, we'll start.
I had a question for Professor Stein.
Me, Rosenstein, and I'm not a professor. Okay, I'm the only one who is.
That's not true.
Oh, yeah.
When I was an undergraduate at Cal, I had a professor from Israel, and he was a German Jew. And at that point, after the war and stuff, he went to Israel, and he became quite a patriot for that country. And the one thing that I found very interesting was up to now, even now, he refuses to speak German, he refuses to read German. And that was his mother tongue. So he adopted Hebrew and will read anything else other than German. But did you ever have a phase like that in your own life where you sort of were afraid to speak your mother tongue and identify yourself as being a German?
The question was, did I have a problem at any time in my life identifying myself being a German? The answer is very positively yes. In all the years in the concentration camp, particularly in Auschwitz and the camps thereafter, I only spoke Dutch and German under duress. During the 5 or 6 months, 4 months in Russia, my father and a group of 12 of us, we were all from Holland, were together. We only spoke Dutch. From that, I went immediately to a French school, and we did not speak German, even amongst ourselves at home in Paris. We only spoke Dutch. It's only been years later that I started enjoying speaking German again. And yes, I went through a long period in my life where I really did not